Hello, everyone. Today I want to do something a little bit different and review a book that I finally just listened to on Audible called Combating Cult Mind Control by Stephen Hassan. And I want to review it mostly just as a former Mormon, although I do have a couple of thoughts regarding the book as a whole as well. Um, and first off, I want to say that my initial impression just listening through the book is actually that I'm not sure how helpful it was to Mormons to include Mormonism in this book. And the reason why I'm saying that is because it says that in earlier editions it wasn't included. And then because of that, people who read the book who were Mormons realized that there were some problems within the LDS church. And they might not have realized that if they hadn't read the book in the first place because Mormonism was included in there. And the way it was included, I felt was not necessarily the best way to include it, because it's only mentioned a few times. And when it is, I don't feel that the full extent of the problems within the LDS church are laid out for people to see. And so I think it would be very easy for somebody who is in the LDS church to listen to this book or to read this book and to come to the conclusion that Mormonism was in there just by mistake and was lumped in with other organizations in ways that it really shouldn't be. So the first time Mormonism is mentioned is in connection with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and both of those groups are called abhorrent Christian groups. So right away, he's making a claim about these groups that weren't included in his first edition of the book, that makes them sound pretty bad. And so you'd hope that he would back up that claim within the book. But as far as I can remember, the only specific information he gives about Mormon practices that lines up with the patterns that he's talking about within the book is when he says that Mormon missionaries are isolated from their families, similarly to the way he was isolated from his family when he was in the moon cult. And so it just seemed to me that it'd be very easy for a member of the LDS church to brush that aside. And then when he went on to the cult survivor stories and included a Mormon survivor story within that, the story basically focused on this guy coming to the understanding that certain things that he'd been told weren't true, and having issues with the truth claims of the church, and that causing him to leave. And I just kind of felt like it didn't go into enough detail about the deceptive nature of the way the church portrays its history, because I think that that was kind of what it was getting at. But because it didn't go into enough detail about that, I can see somebody who was Mormon coming away from reading or listening to that and thinking, well, obviously this person just has an axe to grind when it comes to Mormonism. And this organization that I belong to doesn't belong in this group with all these other organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses who have an active shunning policy, unlike the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so that was my overall thoughts. I'm not sure that the LDS Church should have been included the way it was. I think there's potential for it to be included in the book in ways that are good, but I don't necessarily agree with the way it was handled. And I know that might surprise people. With me being a former member, you would think, well, surely I think it's a cult and think that there's something seriously wrong with it. And I do think there's something seriously wrong with the organization, but I'm not actually sure if it completely rises to the level of cult by the standards that this book puts forward or not, because in some ways, some of the things that I don't like about the organization are in the process of getting better. I think the two settings in which it is the most cult-like are the temple and the mission. And I can go into why that is. In the temple, people make promises that they aren't really told about in advance necessarily, and then pressured very heavily into making as part of the temple ceremony. And that really bothers me. And that is a pattern, apparently, of cults. Something that cults do is get people to make promises under pressure without warning in advance, and then hold them to those promises. And that's something that happened to Stephen Hassan when he was first being recruited into the Moon cult, is that people found out he wasn't intending to come back after hearing a speech of some kind, and they ran out and surrounded his car and would not let him leave until he promised to come back. So he promised to come back, and then he kept his promise because he was the kind of person who believed in keeping promises. But what he hadn't realized was that he had been unduly pressured into making that promise in the first place, and it wasn't okay. And I think that similar things go on in LDS temples. I think there's potential to improve that, though, if temple prep classes get better than they've been in the past. So there is potential for improvement there. And then what with the mission and the temple are connected, of course, because you have to go to the temple in order to go on a mission. And people don't talk about the fact that in order to go on a mission, you basically have to promise everything to the church. You have to promise to live the law of consecration, and you have to promise the law of sacrifice, which is that you will sacrifice everything, even up to your life, for the church if necessary. And that is really disturbing, considering that nobody talks about it very much outside the temple, because it basically means that all these people who are being told to fulfill their mission, which is an important milestone, aren't being told, by the way, when you fulfill your mission, you'll also have to promise everything. And I think that that is something that is bothersome in the way that the church handles things. But then, of course, the way that the church organizes your entire life and structures your entire life during the mission is very typical of the way some cults structure people's entire life just as normal members, to the point where they can't do anything that they want to do without permission, where they're isolated from their families, and so forth. And so I think if you want to look at the church and see its potential downsides, I think looking at a mission is a good way to see that. However, you could argue that because they're only doing it for a relatively short period of time and it's not intended to be forever, it's better in the case of the church than it is in the case of organizations that do it for every member or for a significant portion of their members for a lifetime commitment. So now that I've covered what I think of the book from a Mormon perspective, I want to get into just a couple of thoughts I had about the book, particularly about how he described helping people get out of cults, because I found that very interesting for two reasons. One is that he said that even now, even after he stepped away from the process that he called deprogramming, which often involved kidnapping people in order to get them out of a cult, he made it sound and made it pretty clear that even after he stepped away from that process, he would still sometimes use deception in order to get people out of cults. For example, one time he posed as somebody's boyfriend in order to get that person's sister out of a cult, in order to get himself into that situation where he could make comments that would lead that person to get out of a cult. And ultimately, she did get out of the cult, and it was a good thing. However, I thought that was really interesting given the fact that one of the things that bothers him so much about cults in the first place is that so many of them use deception in order to recruit people. So here he's bothered, and rightly so, by the fact that cults use deception to recruit people, and yet he's admitting to using deception to get people out. And it made me really think to myself, how do I feel about that? Because I don't think I'm an end justifies the means person. I don't think all ends justify all means. However, if somebody were in a cult, in an extreme situation, where I thought that they were in danger of killing themselves due to instruction from the cult leader, would I lie to get them out? I think I would. Because I think that I would value their life over that idea of having to be honest all the time. And that's something that I can say about myself, but then I look at the people who are recruiting people and using deception to recruit people, and they think that they're saving the person's eternal life oftentimes by being dishonest with them temporarily. And so it certainly is something to think about. It's something that makes me uncomfortable to think about. But I think what it really boils down to, and this is something I've said before, is that you can see red flags in someone's behavior that what they're doing might not be right. But what it really comes down to is whether what they teach is true. Because if, for example, the LDS Church is true, then the fact that they are not being completely upfront about their history in their manuals or in their teachings doesn't register in comparison to the truthfulness of the church. And that's why on my channel, I have some videos about talking about how I don't think the LDS Church is 100% good. But most of my content about the LDS Church, I hope, is focused on why I don't think it's true, because I think that's a lot more relevant to the issue here. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about in relation to Stephen Hassan getting people out of cults was that in one of his stories of getting somebody out, the same story where he posed as somebody's boyfriend, he basically got that person to have a spiritual experience in which they thought that God was telling them to leave this organization that they were part of. And as a result, they did. And that was really interesting to me, just based on the fact that I think that one of the big things that keeps people in the LDS Church is that they think they've had a spiritual experience from God telling them to become part of it or to stay part of it. And that really makes it kind of weird for me to hear that he uses spiritual experiences, encourages people to pray about whether their cult is true, and thinks that them getting an answer that it's not is a good thing. And, maybe it is a good thing because they're leaving a bad organization. But as somebody who is in was in a group that gets people to stay by using those experiences, I just don't think those experiences are reliable. And so I have a different perspective on that. And the last thing I want to talk about with regards to this book is that I don't actually think the bite model is the most helpful part of the book. I will still go over the bite model briefly, but what I think is the most helpful part of the book is actually questions to ask people, a list of questions to ask people that you think might potentially be cult recruiters. And I'm going to go over that list of questions, answering them the way I think I might have answered them when I was a missionary for the LDS Church. and how I would answer them now in regards to the LDS Church. But first, I'm just going to go over the BITE model briefly. The BITE model is behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. And the idea is that organizations that are unhealthy, that are called cults in this book, control those 4 aspects of people's lives. Behavior, thought, and emotion are connected and had been connected by someone else before, because people had realized that when you change one of those 3 things, you change the other 2. But Stephen Hassan added information control to that as well, because he realized that a big part of controlling someone's life to that extent involves controlling what information the person has access to, which is often done through deception or through just withholding certain information very rigorously. And so I think that that's certainly worth knowing about and worth pointing out. It kind of feels like information is a bit different from the other 3. Like it's a little bit of a one of these things is not like the others vibe. But I think it's still good having all of that down and being able to look and see different ways that different organizations control different aspects of people's life. And I think for some people that's really helpful. But like I said, for me, that's not really the most useful part of the book. For me, the most useful part was the questions to ask people who are potentially cult recruiters. And so I'm going to go over those questions now and talk about what I think about them. So to start off with, the first set of questions is, how long have you, the recruiter, been involved with this group? Are you trying to recruit me into any type of organization? And as a missionary, I would have said all my life. And I hope that I would have said yes. That would have been the honest thing to say, because obviously we want everybody to join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as missionaries. I think it would have been relatively easy to say yes, because we're not taught directly as missionaries to knowingly lie. And so I think I would have said yes. Although the fact that we're recruiting people to join a church isn't necessarily the first thing we talk about. We talk about reading the Book of Mormon, or listening to the message about Joseph Smith first, or the plan of salvation. But that's definitely in there and something that we're thinking about. So yes, I think that would have come up pretty quickly if someone had asked that question. And the reason this question is important is, of course, because somebody who has been in the organization all their life, like I had, really should know certain things about the church or organization. And if they're not forthcoming about that information, that's a red flag. So moving on, this is an interesting one. Can you tell me the names of all the other organizations that are affiliated with your group? And this is because a lot of groups will use front groups in order to recruit people. I wasn't thinking of the LDS churches using front groups, because in the missionary program, they don't actually use front groups. They go out as missionaries of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the main name and is the church name. And so I would say that, at least in that case, it wouldn't be using a front group. And I probably wouldn't have thought as a missionary to list any related groups. And that probably would have been fine that I wouldn't have thought of that, because we weren't using a special front group at the time. But I have realized there is a set of front groups that the LDS Church does use to recruit internationally, and that is the BYUs, the Brigham Young Universities, because they will try to get people who are foreigners to the U.S. to come over to the U.S. to study at their universities and then try to convert them while there. That's one thing that I saw happening a little bit when we were in China. When I went on a study abroad to China, there was pressure to get people to come to BYU and to advertise BYU, because we couldn't advertise the church legally in China. And so there was this pressure. Well, say good things about your university, talk about your university, because that's what we're allowed to talk about. And so that was kind of a front group, but I kind of see why that happened. And so I'm not completely horrified by that, given that the reason we didn't talk about it was restrictions on talking about the actual church at the time. But yes, that was a front group. Then, moving on, this is an interesting set of questions. Who is the top leader? Tell me about their background and qualifications. Do they have a criminal record? And this set of questions is based on the idea that most organizations that are of this sort are being run by a top charismatic leader that probably started the organization. And obviously, in the LDS Church, the person who started the organization is not the person who runs it now. So, if I was answering on my mission about Thomas S. Monson, who was the president of the church at the time of my mission, I don't know that I would have been able to say much about what he did before he was involved in church work, because I don't think I even know now. So I would have just said he spent most of his life serving the church. And I would have said he didn't have a criminal record, because I don't think he did. And, same with Russell M. Nelson, if he'd been the prophet at the time of my mission, although I do know he was a heart surgeon, so I could have said that. But yeah, I don't think that it's the current leaders of the church that give off the red flags about the church. The top leader originally was Joseph Smith, and he did have a criminal record. And so if I'd been asked about him in more detail, that would have given me cause for a little bit of thought maybe, but I would have thought that all his criminal record came because people were persecuting him for being the leader of a church they thought wasn't true. And so I wouldn't have realized how much of a red flag this was, but it actually was a bigger red flag than I thought. And hopefully, if somebody had asked me this about Joseph Smith specifically, I would have shared with them the correct information, and they would have been turned on to the fact that something wasn't right here. But yes, we didn't talk about his criminal record in the discussions, obviously, in the missionary lessons. I say discussions, but that's really the more archaic version. We were using lessons. So yeah, we didn't talk about that in the actual church lessons, missionary lessons that we were teaching people. What does your group believe? Does it believe that the ends justify the means? Is deception allowed in any circumstances? As a missionary, I would have said no and no. We do not believe that the ends justify the means, and deception I would not have believed was allowed in any circumstances. But it is interesting because even on my mission, I was told to obscure information at one point by one of my senior companions. I can't remember who basically said, when we were discussing the plan of salvation lesson that we were going to give somebody, and I brought up becoming like God, and she basically told me not to talk about that because we didn't want to give people the impression that we thought people could become like God in certain ways, even though that was the impression that I got growing up in the church. And so I went along with that and didn't say anything about that. But looking back, I think that there is pressure to obscure certain information as missionaries, even though we don't think of it as lying. But of course, as a Mormon missionary, as an LDS missionary, I was comparing myself to other churches in Korea, that some of them, one of them in particular, would actively obscure the fact that they were members of that particular church until they got to a certain point in the recruiting process. And so based on that, we actually saw ourselves as really open and honest about what we were doing, because we were comparing ourselves to people who weren't as open as we were. So it kind of is on the spectrum how open you are, but yeah, I think that there's some definite obscuring going on, even though I don't think the missionaries themselves are outright lying for the most part, and they're certainly not being told to lie directly for the most part. Okay, next question. What are members expected to do once they join? Do I have to quit school or work, or donate my money and property, or cut myself off from family members and friends who might oppose my membership? What did you do for a living before you joined the group, and what do you do for a living now? This, I think, would be more helpful probably for other organizations than for the LDS Church, but there are significant things that you have to do as part of the LDS Church. You have to donate 10% of your income in order to be a fully status-containing member of the church. I know that's a bad way to say it, but in order to be fully participant in the church, you have to donate 10% of your income. And in the temple, you make promises to donate everything. So I think if people knew that, they'd realize something isn't quite right here. But we don't talk about what happens in the temple outside the temple for the most part. So I don't think that would have come up. If someone had asked me that question, I would have just talked about the 10%. And then, do I have to cut myself off from friends or family who might oppose my membership? I think the correct answer to that would be no, because there's not a top-down shunning policy in the LDS Church. But it still is interesting to consider that, because I think there is a little bit of pressure to avoid people who oppose membership, but I think that a lot of that comes from internally, people just realizing they don't want the dissonance in their lives, so they cut people off themselves. What did you do for a living before you joined the group, and what do you do for a living now? Most missionaries haven't really had the chance to have a real job yet. A lot of them have been in school up to the point they went on their mission, or just were on their mission straight out of home at this point because of the age change where now 18-year-old men are going on missions. I think, and obviously what they're doing now is not making a living but serving the church. So that's an example of people devoting their whole lives to the church in ways that, if it were for your whole life, wouldn't really be healthy. But it's not going to be for their whole life, and so I don't think that would necessarily raise the same kind of red flags for the LDS church as it would for other churches, necessarily. And then, moving on, is your group considered controversial by anyone? If other people are critical of it, what are their main objections? I think I would have answered this from a perspective that mainstream Christian churches are critical of the LDS church for a number of reasons. And because those reasons didn't bother me, because of course growing up in the LDS church, I thought the mainstream Christian churches were partially wrong. And so to be able to say, oh, well, they think of God differently. They don't believe in the Godhead. They believe in the Trinity. They're critical of it because of this and that they don't agree with. I think I might have been uncomfortable with that question, though, because part of the things that the people in mainstream Christian churches disagree with the LDS church about is the idea that we can become like God, and that was something I was told to obscure on my mission. So I'm not sure how much I would have actually said about that. Now that I'm out of the LDS church, I think the criticisms come from two different sides. I think that there are the criticisms from mainstream Christians, which for the most part I don't really have a problem with. And then there are the criticisms from the secular world, which resonate more, I would say, with things that I'm concerned about. LGBTQ plus issues, for example, is something that resonates more with me than the fact that Mormons don't believe in the Trinity, really. So that's something that I would get into. Oh, the fact that they have a living prophet, that also seems to concern a lot of people from both sides. And I can see why. So that might be something that I would bring up. Then, next question. How do you feel about former members of your group? Have you ever sat down to speak with a former member to find out why they left the group? If not, why not? Does your group impose restrictions on communicating with former members? I don't think that the LDS Church imposes formal restrictions on communicating with former members. What it does do is sometimes say things officially that demonize former members. For example, relatively recently, the president of the LDS Church referred to those who stop having faith in the church as lazy learners. So it's things like that that basically put us in a box as former members because we are being seen as what the president of the church wants us to be seen as rather than what we actually are. And that's really bothersome to us. But there's not an active top-down shunning policy, which is a good thing. How do you feel about former members of the group? If I were being honest and I was asked that, I would say I was scared of them because I thought they were under the influence of Satan to the point that they'd left the church. And that was disturbing to me. Yeah, I didn't want to be around them. Had I ever sat down with a former member to know why they left? No. But part of that wasn't just because I was scared of them. It was also because I didn't know anybody super well who had left at that point. And also because even if I had, there was kind of the impression I had that it was rude to talk about it. I did have an uncle who'd stopped going, actually two uncles who stopped going, but one in particular I want to focus on because I later found out the reason why he stopped going to church. And at the time, I thought it was kind of rude to ask about why he stopped going. I thought that was his business and it was rude to find out. So even though I spent time with him after knowing that he wasn't going to church, I didn't want to ask him why. Now I know why, because through the grapevine of people in my family who have stopped going to church, I've heard about it. And I think that it's sad that I didn't realize that I could ask and that actually he wouldn't have minded probably if I'd asked, because it wasn't rude. It wasn't the rudeness that was keeping me from talking about it necessarily. That was just a cover for the more serious issue that people just don't want to know why people leave. They don't want to know. However, since I've left, people have talked to me about why I've stopped going to church, and I've been able to talk to a couple of different people about it. And so, like I said, I don't think that there's a prohibition on asking people why necessarily. It's just something that tends to happen. Next question. What are the 3 things you like least about the group and its leader? This would have been a hard question to answer. I think the reason actually why it says 3 things is because this is kind of like that job interview question where they ask, what's your worst weakness? And you're supposed to come up with a weakness that sounds harmless. I think that there are ways to come up with weaknesses of the organizations too that sound harmless, and people don't realize that that's a cover weakness. But it's hard to come up with 3 of those. And so by the time you get to the 3rd one, you might actually mention something that's actually really disturbing, really problematic. For me, I probably would have said nothing at the time because I wouldn't want to have reflected badly on the church as an official representative of the church. But I will say the thing that bothered me most at a certain point when I was on my mission, which is that at the time I didn't know of any way to get help if the mission president did something absolutely wrong, because there were sister missionaries in my mission who were terrified of their own mission president. Not because he abused anyone physically or sexually, I don't think, but because he was treating certain missionaries differently than other missionaries, and it got to the point where multiple missionaries in the group that weren't being treated as well noticed it and had problems with it. And they didn't know what to do. And I felt very uncomfortable with that situation, but did not know what to do about it because there's no way to contact anyone higher up in the hierarchy than your mission president as a missionary. And so that was something that really bothered me towards the end of my mission. And next question. What else would you rather do in life than be a member of the group? It says the answer is likely to be nothing. And I think I would have said that, and I think that wouldn't have been honest. Because, to be honest, I had a really hard time on my mission and would rather have been back at school. It was very hard for me to be on my mission. I would have been rather back at school, writing books, doing things that I enjoyed, not being on my mission. And it's unfortunate that if pressured that way, I probably wouldn't have been honest. But that's kind of how it was. Okay, next question. Did you take the time to talk with former members, read critical literature about the group before you joined in order to make up your own mind? Is this something you'd be willing to do now? I would have said no and no. Obviously, I wasn't reading critical literature about the church before I was 8 years old when I was baptized. So no. And I had been taught that anti-Mormon literature was all distorted. So the idea of reading that, I would have thought, well, no. Why would I read something that's full of lies and half-truths and misconceptions? No, I won't do that. And no, I'm not willing to do that. And obviously now, I think that that is really sad and a big sign there's something very wrong with the church, that it can't handle negative literature and that it puts that perspective. I don't know if it's from all the way at the top down all the time, but definitely in my local ward I was told that. And it puts that perspective in people's minds that everything anti is twisted. And I just don't think that's true, as I've said in earlier videos. So that was the last question. I think that that set of questions is particularly enlightening and interesting, so I wanted to go through it and talk about it. I think that that may be the most informative part of the book. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like it and consider subscribing, and I will post more videos in the future. Comment below on your thoughts on whether the LDS Church is a cult or not, and if so, why or why not. And thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time. Bye.